So pushing his luck a little too far, a pilot is killed, and he now gets a second chance to help those he left behind. That's the story of a guy named Joe, and always I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds.
Hello.
And so, of course, we're recording this on Mother's Day, and I was actually thinking about like if there's Mother's Day movies that maybe down the road we'll have to review and stuff in the future. And I think the ones that I kind of found was Freaky Friday, and what was the other one? I forget the other. There's one other movie that was like kind of a parenthood type of movie and stuff like that. So
Well, it's Parenthood,
yeah, yeah.
but also I don't know, Mamma Mia. I'm really just coming up with the top of my head. They're not remakes, though, are they? Is there actually a remake of Freaky Friday?
Yeah, that's actually one that's been done.
Oh, okay.
There's the Disney one originally and stuff, and then there's the one with Lindsay Lohan. That was like kind of done more recently and stuff. So overall, it seems like kind of that's just the pattern that we've seen. Where it's like you have these originals that were done in the '70s, and then 30 or so years later, they had to do the remake and stuff.
Of course, yeah. It's
Um,
required by Hollywood. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I was thinking about also that one other idea that is kind of a little bit connected to today's movies that we're talking about is I think overall it seems like we've become more jaded and more cynical about like kind of these fuzzier themes of love and loss and stuff. We're kind of like less willing to kind of be sentimental about it as if it's something that that's like kind of maybe it's uncool for school, so to speak, and stuff.
Yeah, no, I mean, definitely what we're looking at here is two very sentimental movies with a guy named Joe and Always. Um, but I think that just it's more in terms of what we have to deal with in a day-to-day basis compared to what was going on in 1943.
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
when your life is on the line and lots of your friends are probably facing death and fairly imminently,
Mm.
a nice dance and a a cup of coffee with a gal, these kind of things are probably the simple stuff becomes far more important, and that sort of stuff hits home much more than some sort of abstract sci-fi thriller.
Mm. And that's a great lead into their first movie, then, a guy named Joe. I mean, it's interesting that here's a movie that was made right in the middle of World War II. It's about the war
Mm.
and is made, I mean, it's the equivalent would be kind of like, us making, like kind of a movie about like kind of Afghanistan, like kind of, in the middle. Like nowadays we do documentaries and stuff, but, like I can't even think of any other time that like something like that has happened. And granted, luckily, for knock on wood, we haven't had a war that kind of, is lasted for years and stuff, other than, I guess, the war against terrorism. But even then, we had more political dramas and stuff like that. And then, if anything, it's kind of come out only more recently that we've had movies that kind of, look back at what happened during that time and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think you do get themes like that, but it's just not quite as overt as it was in the 40s. I mean, this feels very much like it's romanticizing war.
Mm.
It almost feels like a sort of a propaganda piece in some
Right.
respects as well. I mean, you could argue that maybe the war against terror, the reboot of Transformers kind of does something about that. You've got robots hiding in the sand, jumping out at people, and you kind of wonder, is there a highly efficient sort of team sort of taking down these things? You wonder, is that some sort of subtle, I don't know, I'm clutching at straws here, but
But I mean, yeah, that's a good point though. That like we've done it in many ways. It's more like a as a metaphor. For example, at some future point, we're definitely going to need to talk about Battlestar Galactica, where with the reboot remake, they basically just use all the stuff kind of happening with robots as a metaphor for the war on terrorism and stuff. And I think that's
yeah.
something that like I think we saw or we've seen happen more over the recent years is that like we tend to use sci-fi or other things as a lens for current events.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think, I don't know, I mean, I guess you still have to remember films were still quite early and still,
Right.
a much more different sort of part of society as they are
Yeah.
than they play now. So yeah, I mean, clearly it felt like the institution, the government was speaking to people through, the
Right.
media of film, definitely. So
Yeah, and that's a great point as well. Is that like there was no doubt, even though that like we didn't have propaganda the way like maybe that the Nazis did or something like that, but there's no doubt that like our government really pushed film studios to kind of do that things that were pro democracy, pro war effort stuff, and
mm,
like there's definitely lots of different documentation about that. I think it's also interesting that we have these actors who different times, um, different ones like Jimmy Stewart from It's a Wonderful Life. He actually had just come back from the war, and that's actually one of the reasons why that movie was made and stuff, because he needed to kind of get back into the swing of things, so to speak, and stuff, because his career was on hold, of course, while he was serving abroad.
yeah.
And so it's interesting, like here we have this star, Spencer Tracy, who apparently he actually was diagnosed with epilepsy, I believe. That like then he was kind of basically disqualified. And it was like kind of also that thing. This is a time we're talking about where instead of people dodging the draft, people were basically running to sign
Mm,
up and stuff and do their part.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think as well, It's a Wonderful Life in some respects it sort of does its job in terms of people coming back from war, in that it's all about home ownership.
Yeah.
Things maybe not all your dreams will come true, but if you look out for yourself and your community, and let's sort of build our communities and our houses, then we'll be all right. If you look at it in that respect, that's very much the kind of message the government was trying to put out about developing suburbia in the US after the war,
Yeah.
because they were fundamentally afraid that all these vets might go haywire on them. So yeah.
And speaking about It's a Wonderful Life connection, we have Lionel Barrymore, who plays the
Yeah.
general up in heaven in this movie, and then also Ward Bond, actually, who's Ernie the taxi driver in It's a Wonderful Life. And then here he's the buddy Al Yaki and stuff. So I think that's one of the things that really is striking between both movies. We'll definitely, of course, talk more about it as always, but we definitely see the friendship element, and that's something I like in a lot of war movies. They really emphasize that, and for a lot of different reasons. And I think, like kind of more recently, Band of Brothers like kind of was a huge hit that really kind of showed this kind of bond that really forms among like kind of whether it's soldiers or just people that like you kind of go through so much together and everything.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think that relationship is played really well between Al and Pete in A Guy Named Joe.
Mm.
There's just very good dialogue all the way through. Lots of sort of snappy, kind of quirky bits, like Irene Dunn saying, a man who plucks his eyeballs, I not plucks his eyeballs, eyelashes. Sorry, those eyeballs would be a very different type of movie. Hellraiser, maybe.
That's the Westworld. Yeah, right.
Yeah, right. And she says, "Oh, I was expecting you to go bald, but if you pluck your eyebrows as well, you look like an egg." Which is, and things, the whole joke about, "Oh, you remind me of my sister." I mean,
right.
And there was just really sort of nice touches like that all the way through that were kind of quirky and very sort of realistic. I did find that a little bit creepy, actually, that someone would think that line would work, but clearly it did in 1943.
And it's funny how like the dialogue is also very much of the 1940s and stuff. I mean,
Yeah,
like talking about putting a woman on your knee to spank her and stuff. I mean,
I
that's
know.
more than a
Yeah,
little bit. That's kind of even beyond racy, I think, like kind of by today's standards.
yeah. And I mean, and there's also a bit where Spencer Tracy sort of says, "Oh, what's that saying again?" Yeah, men must work and women must weep. And I thought, oh yeah. But the thing is, though, in a clever sort of way, I think it actually does do some quite interesting things with that
Hmm.
for its time. I think actually Irene Dunn's character of Dorinda is quite an independent and feisty
Right.
woman, really. I mean,
Yeah.
I really wasn't expecting her to be the one that makes the bombing raid at the end. I thought that was a really interesting touch for something for 1943. But in a way, and you know, she doesn't sort of, you know, Spencer Tracy gives her a lot of slack and says, you know, oh, you're, you know, basically you're a bit too much of a woman, and you should be, you know, a bit quiet and stuff, in a sort of a playful way.
Right.
But you know, she gives it all back, which is really great. But in a way, I kind of feel this was a movie somewhat for the female audience of 1943, because they obviously at that point in the war, a lot of widows, women will have been through quite a lot, and this is kind of, I think, in a way of saying to them, you know, keep your chin up, stay strong. Basically, I think there's a kind of an undercurrent of that in this movie.
But
also,
what
are your thoughts on that?
I think that's a great point too. That like I can't think of, you know, many movies where you see a female heroine basically jump in the cockpit and like kind of, you know, going on a you know, a raid and stuff. I mean, you know, it almost feels like it'll be another 30 or so years before we see anything like that. You know.
Yeah, and it was a very interesting thing to happen, because you didn't know if she was feeling, she missed Pete so much that she was practically suicidal.
Right.
But she, you know, she pulled through it all, and I thought it was, yeah. And so there's this sort of double whammy of she's protecting someone who she's sort of in a relationship with but isn't in love with, and she's sort of, you know, still trying to connect back with the memory, and really takes it to the wire with that final action. I thought it was really, really effective.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that is an interesting question too. Like, why do you think that, like, you know, if she's in fact not in love with, I forget the guy's name actually. The
Rourke, I think, is the character's name. Somebody Rourke, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if in fact, you know, like she's saying that she's not in love with him or anything, but then, you know, like she goes ahead and, you know, like just basically risk her life to save him anyway, and like kind of, yeah, I think that's a great point though. Like, what is like kind of the motivation that was like, you know, like was it like a little bit like kind of, you know, being distraught and kind of, you know, basically, you know, risking your life and maybe, you know, joining Pete and stuff. And
well, yeah. I think actually this is a really interesting thing for the female audience of that time, because you know, they can put themselves in the position of this character who is basically saving the day, and rather than them being, you know, the helpless sort of woman who's watching her man go off to war, she's in the driver's seat protecting, you know, the man that she could be. So I think that's like a really sort of interesting sort of role reversal, something that, you know, would it be quite sort of empowering to watch, I think, in a way.
Yeah.
At that time.
And I guess, you know, in a way that's kind of like a little bit of the fantasy, I guess, aspect of it, of where, you know, it's maybe probably like kind of tapping into like a feeling that probably different women had, you know, during that time, where, you know, not, you know, many women were able to kind of, you know, become, I guess this is the WACS, the Women Air Corps. You know, probably only so many people, you know, women were actually able to sign up and, you know, end up flying or doing something that like was more not quite front line. And that's another kind of key difference too. Like, you know, fast forward, like, you know, probably more than 30 years later before we even have women in combat roles. I think, in fact, it was only like the 90s, I think, we finally started having women in combat, you know, roles or even on combatant ships. I think up to then, like, they're kind of basically limited to medical corps or like things like supply or something that was like non-combatant and stuff.
Yeah, that's probably why the TV show MASH is so clever.
Oh, right.
Because it enables you to have, like, you know, women in the cast and still be, you know, about wartime, respectively.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's not to say, yeah, like realistically, a lot of them probably, you know, risk their lives just as much when, you know, like kind of, if you're like there in the hospital tent, you know, the enemy doesn't care. Like, kind of, you know,
of course,
bombs are still dropping, you know, like kind of irregardless. I mean, granted, you know, like there was supposed to be like kind of Geneva Convention, all kind of stuff, but that was another kind of thing that shifted over time. Was that like after World War II, there was less of these countries that signed up with this Geneva Convention. Like to them, it's like kind of, in fact, occasionally we'll see references to that in modern movies and stuff, where the like kind of especially like in Arab country or something like that, and they'll basically say, we're not a Geneva country.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I mean, in terms of that honor and obeying sort of various codes is very much like the order of the day with this original guy named Joe. Because I mean, I mean, from what I read, apparently the film was made with the purpose of let me find the exact phrase for it, because it's kind of a little bit odd, but it's to suppress the finality of death, apparently. That's the quote they said they used to do it. And apparently also was intended to help war widows cope with the loss. And also apparently to keep some self-control and not sort of, I guess, jump into bed with the next flyboy that comes along. I think that is apparently that's what some of the message of the movie is, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, when you put it that way, it almost sounds like, like a little bit propaganda stuff, and totally, just like where it almost sounds like, okay, let's have a movie to treat these symptoms and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's an interesting sort of idea, isn't it? Using movies to exercise or maybe even therapeutically sort of ease people's minds about various things. But yeah, I mean, apparently the idea was that I mean, and I think that the scene with Lionel Barrymore is very powerful, because there's kind of a jovial tone through most of the movie, and then there's the bit where Spencer Tracy gets quite mean, really, and potentially risks the life of the guy he's trying to look after. And that scene where it's him and Lionel Barrymore talking, if you'll notice in the facial expression, Spencer Tracy's got this kind of furrowed brow, kind of cockeyed kind of look through most of the movie, and then he has this sort of complete sort of relaxation and peace on his face during that exchange. And sort of Lionel Barrymore gives this sort of grandfatherly sort of wise talk about each individual sort of sacrifice is part of the collective future, and it's not just your heroism that counts, even if no one recognizes it. We each play a part and move on. And it's all, I mean, I'm not doing it any justice because it's quite poetic and nice the way he delivers it. And I think they obviously needed like a very high caliber actor to do that scene, because it's very powerful. But that for me was just like, this is your propaganda right here.
And something that's kind of connected to that was the fact that like, Spencer Tracy gets awarded his, like we hear DFC and stuff. DFC is like one of those kind of rewards for heroism for, in flying and stuff. So it's the Distinguished Flying Cross. And so it's interesting how he got his, after he passed away, and he's told that. So in essence, what we're kind of telling through this movie is that like, there's a reason why we reward these things after somebody, posthumously, like they'll still know and stuff, like kind of when they're up in heaven and stuff. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a nice thing to do anyway. It's a sort of recognition of people's sacrifice. But I mean, going back to our thing about sentimentality, I would say, well, actually, maybe I'll save that for when we're about to transition to Always, because that kind of indicates why it doesn't work in Always. But the one thing that I really did find interesting when we're talking about sort of the afterlife and thing is the way they've kind of done it in this movie is there's almost like sitcom music when he turns up in heaven. When he first dies, he's whistling along, and the guy said, Spencer Tracy says, I'm either dead or I'm crazy, and the guy goes, "You're not crazy," and he goes, ding, 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 and then they're walking through heaven. It's a very kind of weird light-hearted bit. And I think what's so appealing about Spencer Tracy's character is that there's part of you that thinks, oh, how's he going to react? You know, he's just learned that he's dead, and yet he's totally kind of cool. And again, we've got this classic kind of stoicism that we see in all kind of cool characters in Hollywood. Because he's just like, well, okay, then where's the boss then? Where's my commanding officer? Off we go. You know, he's just kind of completely accepted the reality and is completely cool-headed about it. So, that was a very, you know, we got the archetypal, you know, then it's John Wayne or the others. But that was what was really nice about his character. And the fact that he's kind of slightly annoyed about being dead, but not really upset in any way, was quite charming.
Going back to that, you know, final attack and stuff like that, I do have to kind of say, though, that, like, it's interesting, you know, coming from military background and stuff, it's interesting how that, like, throughout these movies, you know, like, never mind, like, kind of, you know, one of the more extreme recent cases of Top Gun and stuff, which, of course, the sequel is coming out in sometime this year and stuff. But it's this idea that, like, the rogue, you know, hero, right, and like kind of somebody disobeying orders. In this case, you know, Irene Dunne as kind of, you know, a female hero that's kind of disobeying orders. And I got to tell you that, like, more than likely, like, they would not be celebrating her in real life. Like, kind of, people like kind of like pointing her to, like, you know, okay, there's your cell and stuff, you know, where you're going to be sitting out the rest of the war if we don't execute you first and stuff.
You could take the cynical angle that this is why we shouldn't allow women to fight in the war, because they don't obey orders and they go off and on bombing runs without, you know, I don't know. But I think you're probably absolutely right.
But it's just interesting how we really, and I'm wondering if that's the American thing or just a general, you know, thing across cultures that we celebrate, like, kind of the rogue hero and stuff.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Yeah, I have to think about that.
I mean, it does seem to be pretty universal in the sense that, like, you know, with franchises that are kind of more global nowadays, you know, like, more than recently we talked about the Mandalorian stuff, and we really celebrated about the fact that, like, you know, he was like kind of this mercenary, and then he goes rogue and stuff against his code, and then, you know, like, kind of course everything else from there kind of happens, and then you know, and just, you know, just pretty much I think about any other movie that I could think of that, like, where there's some kind of military establishment and stuff, it's like kind of just that's like the typical, I don't know if you can call it a trope or whatever, but I guess in a way you can, that, like, the hero's got to, like, kind of, you know, basically just disobey his seniors' commands and go by the book and stuff. And then, you know, like, kind of, you know, certainly you see that in cop movies and stuff where, you know, like, kind of it's the angry lieutenant who has to, like, kind of, you know, crack down on his, you know, detective who, you know, has no respect for the, you know, regulations and everything.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because the difference between male and female characters is that what will tend to happen is males will go against their boss, but they'll the boss will still be the boss, and they'll kind of reconcile it somewhere. And you see that with the Nails character in this one as well. But with, at least from Luc Besson onwards, which is where you start getting, you know, female characters in a sort of a mercenary or fighting kind of scenario, they tend to be betrayed by their bosses. You know, there's that. They never. I don't know. There probably are examples where they reconcile it somewhere, but it tends to be like, if they show some sort of combativeness, it's like, oh, they've gone full 180 on them. They've not kind of like, it's not just like kind of banter that goes back and forth. Or, I mean, I could just be generalizing. There may well be good examples of that, but I'm just thinking that's the overall impression I'm getting when I think about it.
Yeah, certainly with the examples that we've seen anyway. So, you know, I also can't think of anything like that, but it is something you know, it seems like some of these ideas come up, and then as time goes on with some of these different discussions, we kind of revisit them and kind of re-examine them and stuff. So I think this will definitely one we'll have to keep in the
I can tell you why that might be. I can tell you why it might be, right?
Okay.
It might be because often romance is between men and women is set up in a combative way in movies.
Yeah.
So if they've got to have some other love interest in the movie, then they can't also have a combative kind of relationship with their boss, because the audience will get confused about who's the actual love interest. It might be something like that. But,
yeah, and certainly it feels like sometimes that, like, it kind of creates a a tension that doesn't exist with like you know with the guys and stuff, right? Is this kind of Sid that's like kind of more like they're semi buddies, like kind of besides the boss and underling kind of relationship. And I think with the women, there's like certainly with going back to La Femme Nikita, there's this kind of hint of like possibly some kind of tension there, and like where it's not quite romance full out, but there's a possibility, there's a hint of possibility that like it could go that way and stuff, even if it doesn't.
Yeah, and I mean, talking of combativeness, if there's such a word, like Spencer Tracy and Irene Dunne are both very kind of like intense, I would say.
Right.
And they really kind of bring some real intensity to their relationship with their various mood swings and anger and then reconciling it the next minute. So yeah, it gives it, and I think that, that sort of high frequency sort of dialogue makes the urgency that much more obvious in the movie, which is what I would say is not the case with the remake.
Yeah, I think that's a great kind of transition into the remake and stuff. Here we have, of course, a Steven Spielberg movie, and he brings in, Richard Dreyfuss, who apparently that when they're working on the set of Jaws, they kind of both kind of realized that, like, through quoting this movie and a guy named Joe different times, that they both had a love for it. So kind of they kept it on the back burner, like, oh, one day we'll have this project and stuff like that. So they both kind of reached a level of success years later. Since Jaws, of course, like this is now in '89, and they go ahead and make it and stuff. So then now in this case, we also, instead of being set in World War II, I thought that was kind of a clever twist that they decided to set in modern era with firefighters, and I thought that really worked effectively.
It's a clever twist in that you can recreate the scenario with planes and firefighting, but it doesn't. Whereas the original was set in wartime, it's a much more everyman movie. A lot of people went through that kind of experience. They went, and you're facing this kind of massive tragedy. Right. So any kind of heroic sacrifice is that much more poignant and touching. Whereas if it's a guy putting out some fires in the middle of the 80s, it doesn't have that kind of social connectedness. Right. And I think that's where a lot of that kind of his heroism falls a bit flat in my view. And I think that's why you don't feel quite as much urgency, as intensity as you did with the original.
Right. I mean, they tried to up the stakes a little bit in that they showed, you saw on the ground these firefighters who were calling for, kind of for their strike and stuff like that. Just kind of like it's the equivalent of a soldier calling for an airstrike. And so I thought that was like kind of, their attempt to try to, up the stakes a bit. But you're right. I mean, kind of overall, a lot of times there's different times that Pete's risking his life. You had to really question kind of, his motivation and stuff. And in fact, I think if anything, that gave a stronger argument for, in this case, Dorinda, played by Holly Hunter, that she's like, why are you doing this? Why are you kind of, kind of risking your life? So in other words, it kind of put things more in her view, and we really sympathize more with her of like, why is this guy like, putting his life, on the limb, like when he doesn't really need to himself at times.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
For, in this case, Dorinda, played by Holly Hunter, that she's like, why are you doing this? Why are you kind of, like kind of risking your life? So in other words, it kind of put things more in her view, and we really sympathize more with her of like, why is this guy like, putting his life, on the limb, like when he doesn't really need to himself at times.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a more sort of personal story about the characters rather than life in general, like the original was. Yeah, and there's no, I mean, the original almost asked this question of, why are we even going to war and what's the point of it all? And there just isn't any of that. He's just a bit of a sort of a reckless firefighter.
Mm.
I mean, which I suppose that's an interesting idea in itself of like, why do people risk their lives to do these sort of things? But I don't think you didn't really understand that motivation, or it wasn't really explored fully in all ways. You just got, he likes the girl and he did something stupid and now he's dead. And that was kind of about all I really got from his character. And I kind of feel sorry for him, and he's got a good friend and stuff, but it didn't really explore the sort of the deeper meanings of why he would need to do that, or what his view on life is, of why you risk your life every day.
Right. I mean, I guess for me, I saw it like kind of that, like through his action, what it seemed to say about his view on life was that like, oh, like, and he did kind of say something along the lines that, we can go it tomorrow, any day, anyway, and stuff. So, why not kind of like, it was more like kind of this, why not have fun while you're at it kind of thing. And he didn't kind of say it quite that way, but I feel like that was like kind of, Pete was like more like an adrenaline junkie even before, like kind of we had, heard the term and stuff. So this was like kind of, his way of like kind of, feeling alive and stuff, because that's one of the things that does come up in this movie is this idea of like, he felt like if working at the school or like kind of, teaching future pilots and stuff was basically, like kind of just the equivalent of like kind of a slow death and everything. And he kind of saw that like, I'd rather be alive, like kind of gone in a spark or flash than kind of, living out in this kind of perpetual existence of like kind of just, flying a desk and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think though, and another sort of, back to this thing of urgency, there's the dialogue and the characters are very intense in the original, and I felt like everyone was very laid back in this.
Yeah.
It's like for people who are sort of risking their lives on a daily basis.
Right.
Aside from some kind of slightly, I don't know, just like off point bits of performance from John Goodman. I mean, I actually think it was less like poor directing, because there's the bit where they're kind of, he's very, very laid back for most of the movie, and then sort of Holly Hunter turns up. She's upset that she's come to sort of see the fire school, the fire sort of fighting school, and he just sort of randomly gets very, very angry about it all. It's not even like any kind of set up exchange or anything. He's just very intense and angry, and she's crying throughout that whole scene.
Right.
It kind of felt like so at odds, and it also felt at odds with their characters as well, because she's portrayed as quite a strong character and he's portrayed as quite a laid back character. So that scene was very jarring like that.
Yeah.
And it just didn't come across as realistic at all. But
yeah, it did feel like kind of, that they had to somehow get her back together with him and stuff. And so they kind of had to like, show her as like kind of as a lost soul without Pete and stuff. I mean, I guess I bought it in the sense of where I could see where they went with it, that like, oh, she was like really just kind of, basically, like robotic, if you will, as an air traffic controller and stuff. You saw her like kind of at the screen, kind of, like, and just basically calling out like kind of, different commands, as air traffic controller. And there are people who like, they operate that way. They're kind of like, it's funny how the air traffic control system is still human driven, but you really could do a better job with machines, to be honest, like kind of, because like different times, like these guys are doing, spending like long hours, and then they make mistakes. And that's sometimes how some of the, unfortunate things have happened because of that. And like in the 70s, you saw like kind of, there was a few different times that was like the news about like how overworked they were, and how that was like kind of just a time bomb and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, like, I think, yeah, like like you said, it did feel like kind of like jarring. It did kind of feel like kind of a little bit forced and stuff. I think like they were just really trying to just pry in that kind of, that transition from, them being apart and stuff, and then, getting back together and everything.
Yeah. And I guess it was sort of there to try and sort of make you obviously how much each of them cared for the Pete character.
Yeah.
But I don't know, it just felt a bit flat for me. But the other thing that is noticeable is that what I kind of liked about a guy named Joe is that when he arrives in heaven, no one explains to him what's going on.
Mhm.
And because he's just in military, and it's framed as like a military kind of
Right.
organization.
Oh yeah.
He just starts following orders, but you don't
Right.
really know why or what he's doing, which was kind of
Right.
nice because you were learning what the point of him being there was about.
Mm.
In this one, you had Audrey Hepburn sort of show
Mm.
up in her last movie, I believe, and
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
she basically just tells him everything about it. She's like,
Right.
right, you died, you come here to help someone else,
Right.
you've got to reconcile your stuff, and
Yeah.
it was just like she was reading the script notes for his
Yeah.
character. It was, kind of, telling and not showing.
Yeah, that is this classic sin that we see with remakes over and over again, that they just
Mm.
have this need for like long expositions. And I for me, like the only reason why like kind of that worked was the fact that like it's Audrey Hepburn. Like kind of like she pulls it off like kind of almost effortlessly, like going through like kind of this long dialogue and stuff. And like it was kind of interesting for them to kind of show this this kind of green area, kind of the burnt out there, one. So that kind of like for me like signified like kind of very loudly that like oh, this is kind of like something magical happening and stuff like that. And I thought that was like a the scene itself was kind of like effective in that sense of having that, showing that and stuff. But then like just to kind of go into this in-depth explanation was like kind of just okay. I don't know, like was there a better way? Like it's ideally like kind of less exposition, but in the end though, like I felt like they did move along fast enough to like kind of get back into things of like kind of what's happened since like kind of peace been gone and everything. I think something that you and I talked about offline though is that like it's interesting how overall always like moves along at a pretty good clip. Like you didn't really feel like kind of things dragged, except for actually this point though, like kind of there's this kind of period after he dies till like kind of getting into back up in the air, I guess, and stuff like that. That like we did kind of like wonder like kind of okay, when are we gonna get back to it and stuff.
Yeah, and I mean the stuff with the planes and the air and the firefighting is really well done. And that's really it's just
that was the movie.
Because, that was the movie basically. But I think the Audrey Hepburn bit for me was a real wasted opportunity because in It's a Wonderful Life. I can't even remember the name of the character, but the one that comes back and kind of helps him figure out what's going on. It's kind of like, there's a bit of a kind of Clarence? A buddy. Yeah, Clarence, there's this kind of like buddy back and forth kind of great. It's a great opportunity to have a kind of some funny dialogue where you can kind of get a little bit existential and you can sort of say, or metaphysical and say, okay, these are the funny things about being dead and what you can do. But she was there for that scene, and then she didn't really. Did she come back in the rest of the movie? She didn't. No. She was just there, and then she was gone.
Yeah.
And I almost wonder whether that was something where they envisaged a lot more for that character, and they thought, oh great, we've got Audrey Hepburn, and then she just decided she wasn't going to do any more scenes in the movie or something because she just kind of disappeared, and it was clearly that kind of buddy setup that I imagined they were going for, but didn't.
Yeah, they definitely in the original, had a lot more of the buddy setup, and then like you said, there was a lot. The dialogue was definitely a lot wittier between the two. So I don't know, maybe that's partially what they originally planned with her and stuff. And certainly, again, Audrey Hepburn, like she would have been the person for that and stuff. But I don't know. I agree with like kind of that. This probably was a wasted opportunity, like kind of having somebody of that caliber and stuff on your film and stuff, and then just simply having them for one or two scenes.
Yeah, I mean, I felt like they almost sort of tried to then rely on the friendship between John Goodman and Richard Dreyfuss to bring some of that kind of stuff, but it didn't really. It fell a bit flat because you can't have any someone who's not there. You can't have much kind of back and forth. So.
Well, there was a few funny ways that they did it though, where like kind of where he's like yelling at Al and stuff. And then
that was actually that was the only funny bit in it, really. Yeah. Give him a chance. Yeah, that was
okay, guy, you get it.
Yeah, that was good, but yeah. The other thing I noticed in this was that there's a bit of sort of poltergeist stuff coming in, because if you notice, there are bits when the characters are there's a bit where he meets the sort of old crazy guy who's living in the shed,
right?
And there's all this strobing, and as soon as I saw the strobing, I thought, oh, poltergeist, he's going to contact someone from the other side. And lo and behold, they did.
Yeah.
And then right at the end as well, when Holly Hunter's kind of trying to, or he helps her, there's a more strobing. It's kind of like,
right.
Yeah. So Steven Spielberg decides that strobing is definitely the subconscious trigger of we're going to the other realm now.
Yeah.
And also the blue was used a lot, like, both. There was this strong blue light on the plane and Anna's face when, she has this sort of intuition that he's going to die. And that actually, for me, was one of the most interesting things about the original, was this idea that there's this phrase, your number's up.
Number's up, yeah.
And I thought that's a really, and she even describes it in the movie. She says, oh, you remember that guy, we saw him the night before and he looked like a ghost, and then he went. And I actually wondered whether that was a real thing, whether there are, there is this thing of people being able to sense when someone's number is up, so to speak. Because, I mean, and this is very much kind of a sidetrack here, but there's this guy, Dr. Peter Fenwick, who's spent a lot of his life researching near-death experiences and interviewing people on sort of nursing wards about people who work around people who are about to die, and there's all sorts of really weird phenomena.
Yeah,
like there's a good percentage of nurses that report clocks stopping and machinery stops working, like at the moment of death, and lots of people reporting that they have conversations with loved ones and things like this. And it's a lot of stuff we're definitely at the woollier end of the sweater here in terms of science, but it all is definitely interesting stuff, and I wondered if this was like a phenomena that was known, so to speak, between pilots or people in war.
Yeah, I think that's like partially kind of what just kind of puts these movies, like we kind of talked about the sentimentality and stuff, but I feel like the other part about it is like there's this kind of like you said, whether it is kind of like things at the fuzzier edges of kind of reality, so to speak, and stuff. And where I feel like different times, where we have a real like kind of death is like kind of like we talk about the final frontier stuff. Death is really it where like we still don't have really any way to kind of show one way or another what does really happen after we pass away and stuff. I think that's the thing that like it's kind of going to gnaw at us like kind of till X years still and stuff like that. What I mean by that is that like probably ever since like at the beginning of when we started telling stories and stuff, we probably started like kind of really trying to come up with stories with like kind of with death and what happens after death and stuff like that. And so I feel like that's kind of what it's all connected to, that like we have this kind of like going back to J.J. Abrams' term, kind of the ultimate mystery box stuff is like, okay, what happens like kind of this box called death and everything. And yeah, I mean, unlike other boxes where we have some chance of like kind of, opening up one panel and kind of glimpsing in and stuff, this is the one that like, we just haven't figured out any way to kind of really, even just to, get a glimpse at what's inside and stuff.
Yeah, tunnels of light and floating above your body is about as close as we get. And scientists now sort of say that's completely all in our minds anyway, and it's all related to DMT and stuff.
Right.
So, yeah, but I mean, also, if we're talking about kind of afterlife comedies, which is not that It's a Wonderful Life is really, but it's kind of another.
Oh yeah.
It's not so much. I mean, I kind of view it in the same way because it's almost like someone being taken out of their life and to be able to view it objectively from outside. But whereas that one is like the idea of taking stock of your life as a whole. This is the idea of taking stock of your relationship as a whole.
Yeah. Because
it's kind of a romance. It's an afterlife romance. I guess Ghost is almost like another kind of reimagining.
Oh yeah.
Of this idea. but I mean, it's a nice kind of sentimentality. And I mean, it gives you as the viewer that perspective where you can sort of go back and say, oh well, if the plane was going to crash tomorrow, then I probably should have been a bit nicer. Generally, it's you look at the good times and things like that. So.
Yeah, there's one film commentary that talked about how this may have been the movie that paved laid the foundation for Ghost and stuff. That sometimes with especially with like the major studios and like kind of the bean counters and stuff is like to justify your budget for your particular project and stuff. Sometimes you need like kind of a film that like at least has some modest success to basically show like kind of like, oh, this is like viable, this is like kind of a project that we can possibly get some success with and everything. And then of course Ghost turned out to be a major hit. I feel like that in some ways is kind of like gave ground to like kind of a bunch of other like kind of after that and stuff. And so I think that's the thing that like is interesting as well, that like sometimes somebody's got to be willing to be the canary in the tunnel and stuff.
Absolutely. I think there were more kind of movies about the afterlife I don't know, I just seem to remember more of them from that era back to like the 70s. And they kind of, there's not a huge amount. I mean, I guess the only things I can think of is Ghost and Sixth Sense and
right,
probably a little bit. And more recently, the independent movie with Robert Redford. I can't remember. It's called The Discovery. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's about them, talking about a mystery book. They basically sort of film people as they die and what happens and what they see and things like this.
Right.
That's an interesting movie. It's a good thought-provoking movie there. Not a comedy, unfortunately, but yeah.
So the other thing that like we talk about how this like kind of in some ways a meditation on relationship and stuff. I think it's interesting how in always it comes up more the idea about how love is like kind of this tug of war between like kind of commitment and then like kind of having your own freedom and stuff and choice. Like we didn't see that as much in the original, and I felt like in this one it's like I don't know, somehow for some reason it's put more in the foreground that like basically the Holly Hunter character of Dorinda is like kind of saying like hey, you either kind of give this stuff up or like kind of that's it, I'm walking out. I mean, it was basically the same ultimatum that Irene Dunn gave and stuff, but I don't know, for some reason it came across stronger as a thing of like you either choose to show that you love me by kind of giving up this kind of risk taking and stuff, or that's it and everything.
Yeah. I mean, I guess there's less emphasis put on that in the original because people did have to go do that. He doesn't really have to. He doesn't really have to do this.
Right.
I think as well the other weird thing on terms of the relationship in the remake of Always is that it's a bit Oedipal. It's a weird kind of. Richard Dreyfuss is almost a little bit of a sort of a father. I felt Holly Hunter was not exactly in the daughter range, but quite a bit younger than him.
That's true.
And the new guy who he sort of takes over the consciousness of,
right.
Is almost like young enough to be. It seems like he's almost like a son figure.
Right.
And right at the end, it's sort of like he's reconciled that he has to let go of her. And he said, that's my gal and that's my guy, that's my boy. And it's like, yeah, so you're like this weird father figure in some Oedipal triangle going on here. So that was a bit strange, and because there isn't really that in the original. It's kind of just like she has to just let go, but it's not stated that she's going to go back to Rourke, or it's just that she has to kind of move on with her life.
Yeah, that is a striking contrast, though, is that like we have almost like again the MTV effect, kind of where the replacement for the junior pilot, right, is Brad Johnson, who like kind of is kind of pretty much like a GQ model kind of looking guy and stuff. Whereas like the original, like the original Ted in that case, he's actually I guess called Rourke and stuff like we were saying. Don DeFury is definitely like kind of just not like kind of he doesn't have like kind of that the kind of like
No.
striking looks at all and stuff. So
What the thing they clearly were going for with his character, they wanted someone baby faced, because, and I think that's a way of subconsciously making you recognize that they shouldn't be together in a way. Because the first thing my wife said when she saw that, she was just like, "But she's clearly too old for him," and and I'm sure that's why they kind of cast him like that. It's to sort of negate the possibility that this could be a real relationship subconsciously for people.
Interesting. Yeah.
I think so anyway. But.
And sorry, I had to kind of correct myself. It was actually Van Johnson playing the Ted in the original and stuff. So.
Right.
But he's definitely was known like kind of for these kind of movies where he's pretty much playing like kind of this optimistic kind of what's called young kind of I don't know about new, but like kind of just this guy who's like kind of like a greenhorn, so to speak, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But often like kind of in front of more comic roles actually typically. So
apparently this launched his career.
Yeah.
Joe, it's one of his early movies. Yeah.
So
but it's sorry, go on. Yeah.
Oh, I was gonna say like kind of it's interesting how also that along the lines of the love and stuff like that, and we kind of like saw like where in the original like kind of we really see like kind of that is kind of nurturing the pilot and kind of really like kind of giving almost like an edict to do that and stuff. And then here like Audrey Hepburn's character Hap is like telling him hey like anything that you do for yourself now is like wasted and stuff. And he kind of like still like is trying to like, and I think like that to me was like kind of a little bit of the cringeworthy moments and stuff, which like where besides like kind of the father kind of figure thing stuff was also the moments where Richard Dreyfuss is there and like these like, kind of I felt like kind of the more intensely romantic scenes in always that like we're seeing and he's there and like kind of and he's like literally like kind of like kind of almost like yelling like stop this like kind of and of course like they can't hear him and stuff like that, and then I felt like that was like kind of more cringeworthy I think than the original and stuff.
Oh, definitely, yeah. I mean, you felt like he was just kind of goofing off, and they tried to make a kind of a half-hearted comedy out of it. Whereas the original it's clever in that Wayne definitely as a 1940s movie. So sacrificing yourself in service of others, and
right.
Everyone pulling together collectively are the main messages. But you'll notice things like even though he's a rich character, when he pays for the phone call for the other guy that's homesick, you see sort of Spencer Tracy's character going, oh, at least he knows how to spend his money.
Yeah.
And things like this. There's this real kind of, so it's I mean, that's quite a charming scene, but there's also, but the fact of him sort of giving him dating advice sort of subconsciously
right.
is also has a kind of a social commentary aspect as well. And that he's saying, you don't know how long you got until your number's up. You might as well live life to the fullest today, rather than just kind of goofing off and making people put paint on their face in the remake, which, doesn't have the same kind of weight to it.
No.
And also kind of is witty as well. So.
Right.
So yeah, again, a big difference for me.
And then probably like the last thing that I feel like was a striking difference was that what you saw in Always to me was that the friendship is like kind of a little bit of the tension between like being supportive and then being like enabler. So like we talked already about the scene where John Goodman kind of really snaps and kind of comes back at Dorinda to kind of get on with the life and everything like that. And I felt like maybe like now looking back at that, like maybe they wanted to kind of make a somewhat of a statement about how that sometimes with friendship you need to kind of basically do a call to Jesus and stuff and kind of tell the a friend to like basically like kind of hey, look what you're doing to yourself and stuff like that. So in that respect I can kind of see like kind of that like that scene did have the jarring effect of of like an intervention, I guess, in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's just more realistically handled in the original. I mean, Al is quite sort of stern with Dorinda's character, and
Yeah.
puts the photograph away and says, you need to get on with things. But I mean, they kind of somehow reconcile it realistically by the end of the scene. She goes to the party. It just felt very much like she's crying, he's shouting. What's going to happen next in the remakes? And I don't know. Just my criticism of it. Yeah.
Right.
No, you're right though. Yeah.
But yeah, I think to your point though, like it just kind of seemed to come out of nowhere and stuff like that. I guess it's like kind of that's the thing that like I don't know, like kind of that it did seem out of character, and then maybe that was the point and stuff. I'm just posing it as that, like, maybe that was what they were trying to do with that, and then but then of course, like kind of in the end, a lot of these kind of things are like, does it still work and everything like that, and I guess for me, like I can kind of see it that way, that like that was the point, and that was like kind of why they did it that way and stuff like that. But then I do agree that like it was kind of pretty jarring and kind of did seem kind of like kind of coming out of nowhere and stuff.
Well, I think the main difference is that you had a lot more. It took a lot longer for him to die in the original than it does in the remake, and that's not so much in that. I think time-wise, and this is the other weird thing we were talking about. The original seems very long, even though it's not a long movie, and the remake seems quite short, even though it's a longer movie. It's a really weird thing that how it plays with your attention. But I think that's because there's more action in the remake, and there's more dialogue and character building in the original.
Right.
But by the time he dies, there's been quite a lot of dialogue between Al and Dorinda. So there is quite there's a much more relationship established than I would say there was in the remake between the Al and Dorinda, John Goodman and Holly Hunter in the remake. So that may be why it's more jarring, or why that scene was hard to direct or hard to fit in with the general kind of narrative of the story, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, let's face it. Steven Spielberg is really not known for like kind of like he's definitely not an Aaron Sorkin kind of dialogue-driven kind of director and stuff. He really is known for action, and that's kind of what he was really playing to his strengths, I guess. And then, but meanwhile, though, to the detriment of like kind of the drama and stuff, it would have probably been more effective if there was more dialogue in terms of the characters and stuff. And like kind of that's one of those things that like with any kind of movie / designing something, I guess, like like you can have a director who's like really great at dialogue, but then they probably would just never be able to pull off the stuff that Steven Spielberg was able to do for like Jurassic Park, never mind like kind of this movie and stuff.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean but I mean there's other, I mean certainly I think there's other movies that he's definitely managed to create compelling dialogue and drama with characters, not necessarily action. I just don't think this was one of his best moments, really, unfortunately.
Not by any stretch.
Yeah.
Any last thoughts as to just kind of how these movies overall did in translating from original to remake? And
yeah, I'm just trying to sort of think about. There was I mean, there was another kind of interesting idea, which is probably something that came up from maybe Poltergeist or something else like this. But I mean, if you'll notice that, like with the strobing as well, basically, if you're mad, you can potentially talk to the dead. And also, if you're dreaming, he has this other idea that, if you're in a liminal mind state, you can somehow commune with the dead.
Yeah.
Which was another kind of idea in there on a sort of metaphysical level. I think apart from that, it's there was one other thing I noticed. I don't know if you noticed this. There is actually a Star Wars sound effect in the movie. Right, basically towards the end when Holly Hunter's plane is she's trying to pull up and she hits a branch, there's actually a TIE fighter blast in there. And it's pretty obvious when you rewatch it, but take another look at that, because it's clearly like a TIE fighter shooting at something. The only other, I would say, the only other thing I really thought was that was a big difference, and I kind of liked was this idea of, at the beginning of the movie, of the original, you had Spencer Tracy trying to relay what it was like to fly to the kids. And he was trying to sort of explain what that experience is like. And the fact that they kind of mirrored that at the end, with him kind of relaying that either consciously or subconsciously to Dorinda, was a really nice kind of echoing. And it really kind of, it made you feel like her character had she'd risen above all the troubles of what she'd been through, as well as sort of physically rising above in the plane. And I just thought that was a really nice kind of way of showing her journey and his character as well. Because he goes from someone who's kind of bound up in earthly worries to someone who's sort of like, transgressed to a higher level. I thought it was really well done, that. So
cool. Alrighty. So yeah, coming up, we've got Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3, and then we'll definitely plan on looking at the original remake versus remakes of from Seven Samurai and what's called Magnificent Seven, and of course the offshoot of that of the Battle Beyond the Stars. So definitely that'll be an interesting conversation as well. So once again, thanks for watching, and I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds, and we'll catch you next time.